It was late when he stepped off the bus. The sky above the street was a deep, swallowing black, the kind that didn't just hang overhead but seemed to seep downward, thickening the air. The street lamps, pale and half dead, glowed weakly, halos of yellow trembling in the damp night. A faint drizzle had started hours ago and never quite stopped. Each droplet hit the pavement with a whisper, tiny, endless taps against the hollow silence of the street. His shoes clicked against the uneven sidewalk. It wasn't the sharp, confident rhythm of the morning commute, but a slow, measured cadence, almost reluctant. The weight of the day still clung to him, pressing into his shoulders, making his steps heavy. The wind was colder than it had been earlier, though the weather report had promised mild temperatures. It slipped beneath the collar of his coat like cold fingers, finding his skin no matter how he turned away from it. As he walked, the familiar route home stretched ahead, lined with dark houses whose windows reflected nothing but the dim light of the lamps. Most of the curtains were drawn, but a few hung open, revealing slices of unlit rooms inside. The occasional flicker of a television gave brief, eerie glimpses of walls and furniture before sinking them back into shadow. Somewhere far off, a dog barked once, abruptly, and then fell silent. The sound seemed to carry too far, echoing faintly in the emptiness. It was the kind of quiet that wasn't truly silent. Small noises existed, but each felt magnified: the shuffle of his shoes, the sigh of the wind, the faint, constant patter of rain. He reached the corner where the street narrowed, bending slightly before climbing toward his house. The sidewalk here was broken in places, cracks filled with dark water that reflected distorted shapes of the lamps above. His own shadow shifted and bent across them, long and strange, moving with a fluidity that didn't seem entirely connected to his own steps. The drizzle thickened into a fine mist, settling on his coat, dampening his hair. His hands, shoved deep into his pockets, curled slightly as though holding something invisible. The cold was finding its way into his bones, but he didn't speed up. There was a strange comfort in the unhurried walk, as if dragging out the distance between here and his front door felt safer. Up ahead, his house came into view. The roof line was a dark silhouette against the sky, sharper and more imposing than he remembered. The windows reflected nothing. They were flat, black rectangles that made the place look abandoned. Even from here, he could see the faint outline of the porch light, a soft, dim glow that should have looked welcoming, but instead seemed isolated, like a candle flickering in a vast, lightless space. He slowed as he approached the short walkway leading up to the door. The hedges on either side had grown unruly, their branches dark and wet, bending inward as though trying to close off the path entirely. Drops of rain clung to the leaves, catching the weak light and trembling in the breeze before falling soundlessly into the soil below. When he reached the steps, the boards beneath his shoes gave the familiar creak, though tonight it sounded sharper, thinner, almost strained. He paused for a moment, the faint smell of damp wood mixing with something else, an odor he couldn't quite place, metallic and faint, carried in the cold air. His key was already in his pocket. He pulled it out, feeling the cold metal against his fingers. It felt heavier than usual, as if the day had not only worn him down, but somehow seeped into the objects he carried. The rain had stopped now, leaving the air dense with moisture. He fit the key into the lock, the tiny metallic click oddly loud in the stillness. For a moment, he didn't turn it. His other hand rested lightly on the doorframe, feeling the cool, faintly rough texture of the wood. The porch light hummed faintly above him, the sound low and constant, almost inaudible unless he focused on it. He twisted the key. The tumblers shifted with a sound that was both familiar and, tonight, strangely brittle. The lock yielded, and the door moved slightly inward with the faintest sigh of hinges. Warm air brushed his face, carrying the subtle scent of his home, something that should have been comforting but tonight felt off. Not wrong in any obvious way, just different. He pushed the door open slowly. The hinge's complaint was longer this time, and the dim light from the porch reached only a few feet inside before dissolving into the heavy darkness beyond. He stepped in, closing the door behind him, and for a moment he stood completely still. The air was warmer, but thicker too, almost humid. He became aware of the faint ticking of the clock in the hallway, but the sound felt slower than it should have been, each tick dragging slightly into the next. The faint hum of the refrigerator came from the kitchen, but even that seemed quieter, distant. He set his bag down by the door, the muffled thud sounding strange, as though the floor had absorbed it too completely. His coat hung heavier than it should have as he shrugged it off, the fabric making a faint, wet sound. Droplets clung to the cuffs, catching the dim light as they fell, vanishing soundlessly into the carpet. The darkness inside was layered. The first layer was the absence of light, the simple lack of illumination. But beneath that was something denser, a shadowed stillness that didn't feel entirely natural. His eyes began to adjust, pulling vague outlines from the dark, shapes of furniture, the faint glint of picture frames on the wall. Something in the arrangement felt subtly shifted. He couldn't yet place it, not in any obvious way, but the familiarity he expected was broken, replaced with an undercurrent of strangeness. He took a step forward. The floorboard beneath his foot gave a faint, hollow sound that felt louder than it should have been. Another step, then another. Each was measured, the sound of his movements carrying strangely in the air. The faint smell of the place wrapped around him, warm, familiar scents, dulled by something else, something faint and metallic, lingering just at the edge of recognition. It wasn't unpleasant exactly, but it didn't belong. He glanced toward the staircase, barely visible in the darkness, its railing catching the dimmest glimmer from the porch light outside. The shadows at the top were absolute, a blackness that seemed to push back against his gaze. He didn't go up, not yet. Instead, he stood still again, listening. The house was quiet, too quiet. Not the natural quiet of an empty home, but a quiet that felt almost expectant, as though the air itself was holding its breath. His eyes traced the lines of the hallway, the outlines of familiar doors, the frames of pictures he couldn't quite make out. The ticking of the clock continued, each beat marking time in a way that felt slightly irregular, though he couldn't be certain. The air seemed to press in, the warmth feeling less like comfort and more like a closeness, as though the walls were leaning inward, narrowing the space around him. He drew in a slow breath, the sound of it too loud in the stillness. Somewhere deep in the house, something creaked, a faint, distant sound, too soft to place. He didn't move, not yet. He remained still for several seconds, the faint echo of the distant creek dissolving into the thicker quiet that followed. His ears strained for another sound, but none came. The air felt heavier now, each breath settling in his chest as though it needed to be worked free again. When he finally moved, his steps were slow, the weight of his body pressing faint groans from the old floorboards. He moved toward the hallway, the dim shapes of picture frames beginning to resolve. Something about their arrangement pulled at the back of his mind, a quiet tug of recognition gone slightly astray. One frame, the third from the left, hung slightly lower than the others. He had passed it countless times before, but it had always been perfectly aligned. Now it sat crooked, the tilt almost imperceptible, but enough to catch his eye. He reached out, fingers brushing the cool glass. The surface felt faintly damp, as though a film of condensation clung to it. He wiped it with his thumb, but the smudge it left behind seemed darker than it should have been, as though the image beneath was obscured. The photograph itself was familiar in form but not in content. He knew it should have been a picture of the garden in full bloom, sunlight spilling across green leaves, the bright red of flowers, but what lay behind the glass now was muted, gray, the shapes less distinct, almost blurred. He stared at it longer than he meant to, then moved on. The next frame was wrong as well. He couldn't recall the exact image it should hold, only that the figures in it, himself, others, were sharper in his memory than the faded, almost washed-out silhouettes behind the glass now. He felt the faintest tremor run through his fingers and pulled his hand back. The kitchen lay at the end of the hallway. Light from the street outside slipped in through the small window over the sink, casting a pale rectangle on the counter. He stepped into the doorway and stopped. The layout was the same: cabinets, table, chairs, but the details unsettled him. The chairs were at slightly different angles, as though someone had moved them and only loosely put them back. The fruit bowl that usually sat centered on the table was pushed toward one edge, containing only 2 apples instead of the 5 he remembered buying 2 days ago. The hum of the refrigerator still came from the corner, but it was quieter, deeper, almost like a slow, steady breathing. His eyes lingered on it, but nothing moved. He stepped to the table, his fingertips brushing its surface. It was colder than he expected, almost as if it had been sitting in a draft for hours. A faint residue of dust caught the streetlight's glow, and that alone was strange. He had wiped it clean just the night before. A glass sat near the sink, faintly clouded, a ring of water marking its base. The smell in the kitchen was slightly different, too. Still the faint warmth of wood and the lingering trace of last night's dinner, but with something underneath, something sharper, metallic. It clung to the back of his throat. He turned back toward the hallway. The quiet pressed harder here, the air seeming denser with every step. As he passed the frames again, he avoided looking directly at them. The living room opened to his right. The shape of the furniture was familiar, but the arrangement was not. The sofa had shifted by inches, not enough for someone else to notice instantly, but enough for him to feel it like a bone out of place. The coffee table was further from the couch than it should be, its legs leaving faint impressions in the rug where it had once stood. The lamp in the corner was angled differently, casting its thin cone of light not on the center of the rug, but toward the far wall, where it left a pale, warped oval. He moved slowly into the room. The smell here was drier, almost stale, though the house had been closed only since the morning. He brushed his fingertips across the arm of the sofa. The fabric was cool, slightly rough, and when his hand lifted, the faintest trace of dust clung to his skin. His eyes traced the spines of books along the shelf. He knew their order, had kept it for years, but a single volume, a thick, leather-bound one, sat where it had never belonged. He reached for it, the cover grainy under his fingers. When he opened it, the pages inside were blank, not yellowed with age or damaged, simply empty, white, and without texture. He shut it again, returning it to its place, or rather, to the place it had been set. He wasn't sure he wanted to disturb the arrangement further. The lamp in the corner flickered once. The light dimmed, then returned, though it seemed fractionally weaker than before. The shadows along the far wall shifted in the momentary darkness, elongating unnaturally before settling again. A sound came from upstairs then, soft, like the faint drag of fabric across a floor. He froze, breath held. It didn't come again. He turned his gaze toward the staircase. The shadows above remained unbroken, but he could feel them, the way one feels a storm behind heavy clouds. He thought of calling out, but the idea felt wrong, as though acknowledging the sound would invite something closer. Instead, he moved along the perimeter of the living room, past the edge of the rug, and into the small alcove near the base of the stairs. From here, the hallway upstairs was a tunnel of darkness, the banister's smooth curve leading up into it. The air seemed cooler here, carrying the faintest draft that smelled of wood and something else, dust, old paper, something dry. He didn't move upwards yet. Instead, he stepped into the small storage room under the stairs. It was cramped, the single bulb overhead casting a harsh cone of light that left the edges in shadow. Boxes lined the walls, their tops closed but their sides bulging faintly. He crouched, pulling open one near the front. Inside, objects he didn't remember owning. An assortment of small porcelain figures, all white, featureless except for faint impressions where eyes should have been. He touched one, and it was warm as though it had been held recently. A faint, almost inaudible tapping reached him then, rhythmic but slow. It came from above, through the ceiling of the storage room, directly from the floor of the upstairs hallway. He stared upward, the sound threading into the stillness, then ceasing abruptly. He closed the box slowly, the porcelain figure's faint warmth still clinging to his fingers. When he stepped back into the open space near the stairs, the air felt different again, thicker, pressing more insistently against his skin. In the hallway beyond, the crooked pictures seemed more so now, though he couldn't be certain whether they had shifted further or if his mind was beginning to catch more details. The ticking of the clock had taken on a subtle irregularity, like a heart missing beats. The sensation of being watched pressed at him, not from outside the windows, but from within the house itself, as though the walls had developed an awareness. He glanced toward the kitchen again, half expecting the faint rectangle of streetlight to be gone. It was still there, but dimmer, as though the night outside had thickened. He found himself at the base of the stairs, one hand resting on the rail. The wood felt warm under his palm, warmer than the surrounding air. The shadows above remained still, but he could almost hear something waiting there, a silence with weight. He took one step upward. The board groaned softly. Another step. The air grew cooler with each rise, and the smell of dust and wood became stronger. Somewhere above, something faint shifted, a sound that might have been a footstep or might have been nothing at all. He paused halfway up, his breath shallow, his gaze fixed on the top landing where the darkness was deepest. Somewhere in that blackness, something felt like it was listening. The upper landing waited like an open mouth. His hand tightened on the rail, and his body leaned forward almost against his will. The air felt heavier now, not just cold, but thick enough to make each breath feel deliberate, measured. The shadows seemed to pull inward toward the hallway as though the darkness itself had weight. He reached the top step. The carpet underfoot was softer than he remembered, the fibers almost too plush, muffling his movements completely. No boards creaked here, no sound escaped his steps. Only the steady rhythm of his breathing filled the air until it didn't. A voice, low but clear, slipped from the far end of the hallway. "Who's in my house?" It wasn't shouted, it wasn't even loud, but the way it sank into the walls made it feel everywhere at once, inside the hallway, behind him, above him, and somewhere beneath his skin. His body went rigid, one hand still on the rail, the other hanging at his side like dead weight. The voice had been male, deep, not angry, but filled with an unsettling calm, the kind of calm that precedes something inevitable. For a long moment, he didn't move. The hallway seemed longer now, each door along it slightly ajar, the darkness inside each room deeper than the one before it. A faint light, moonlight maybe, filtered in from the far end, cutting a narrow silver stripe across the floor. He swallowed, the sound unnaturally loud in his own ears. No other sound came. The voice didn't repeat itself. The silence that followed was somehow worse than the words had been. He took one step forward. The carpet gave no sound beneath him. Another step. The door to the first room on the right hung open by just a few inches more than before. He could feel the air from within, colder, faintly smelling of something old and sweet, like flowers left too long in a vase. He didn't look inside. The next door on the left was wider open, a strip of deeper darkness spilling into the hall. Something about it felt wrong, not just the darkness, but the angle of the opening, as if the door had been pushed from inside and then stopped, waiting. He reached the point where the narrow beam of moonlight cut across the carpet. It seemed brighter than it should have been, the silver-white glow sharp against the surrounding dark. As he stepped into it, his shadow stretched unnaturally long ahead of him, bending slightly as though pulled toward the last door at the end of the hallway. That door was closed. The closer he came, the more certain he felt that the voice had come from behind it. His palm was damp against his side, his breath shallow and quick. The handle was dark metal, the kind that should have felt cold, but when his hand closed around it, it was warm. He hesitated. The quiet pressed harder now, filling his ears until he could hear his own pulse. His grip on the handle tightened. He pushed. The door swung inward with a soundless glide, revealing a room bathed in a pale bluish light from a window on the far wall. The curtains shifted faintly, though the air was still. A bed sat in the center, neatly made, the covers smooth and undisturbed, and in the chair beside it, facing the window, sat a man. His back was to the door, his figure tall but lean, shoulders straight. The light from the window caught the edges of his hair, dark and unmoving. His hands rested on the arms of the chair, fingers curled loosely. For a moment, Nothing happened. The man didn't turn, didn't move. Then, in the same calm, measured voice as before, he said, "I asked you a question." His throat tightened. He opened his mouth, but no sound came out. The man in the chair tilted his head slightly as though listening. The movement was small, but it carried an unnatural smoothness, like a joint bending without resistance. "You shouldn't be here." The words were quieter now, but sharper. The air in the room shifted, pressing downward, heavy enough to make his chest ache. He took a step back. The floor beneath him felt softer, spongier, as though the carpet was soaking up moisture that wasn't there before. His eyes darted toward the hallway, but the doorway seemed farther away, the light dimmer, like the corridor was being pulled backward from him. When he looked back at the man in the chair, the figure was standing. It hadn't turned. It hadn't risen in any normal way. One moment it was seated. The next it was upright, still facing the window. Something about its proportions was wrong now. Its arms slightly too long, its shoulders drawn higher. He backed toward the door. His breath was shallow and fast, but the sound seemed swallowed by the thick air. The man turned. The motion was slow at first, then unnaturally fast, the head rotating a fraction too far before stopping. The face was wrong, not monstrous, but wrong in the way a photograph becomes distorted when developed improperly. The features blurred at the edges, shifting slightly as though struggling to hold a single shape. And the eyes, they were entirely black, reflecting nothing. Looking into them felt like leaning over a cliff so deep there was no bottom. The figure stepped forward. The floor didn't creak. The movement was silent, fluid, each step bringing it closer with an ease that made no sense. He stumbled back into the hallway. The doors along it were all open now, wide enough to reveal only more blackness inside. From that blackness, faint shapes seemed to shift, as if something stood just inside each threshold, waiting. The air grew colder, the smell of dust and metal stronger. His pulse pounded in his ears as he turned and ran. The carpet seemed to pull at his feet. The hallway stretched. The staircase should have been close, but it wasn't. Each step forward felt like moving through water, the walls inching closer as though to squeeze the space shut. Behind him, the sound of steps, soft, deliberate, followed. He reached the stairs at last and nearly fell down the first few steps, gripping the rail to keep from collapsing entirely. The wood was slick now, faintly warm beneath the moisture. The downstairs was darker than before. The shapes of the living room furniture were strange again, taller, sharper, casting thin, blade-like shadows across the walls. The ticking clock had stopped. He reached the front door, fumbling for the lock. His fingers shook, the metal of the key slick in his grip. The lock turned too easily, and the door swung outward into the night. Except it wasn't his street outside. The porch light still glowed, but beyond it, there was no sidewalk, no neighboring houses, only a dense black forest, trees rising high and close together, their bark slick and dark with moisture. The air beyond the door was colder still, carrying a damp, earthy smell that didn't belong to his neighborhood. He froze, staring at the forest, the faint mist curling through its trunks. Behind him, the voice spoke again, closer now just at his ear. "You've been here before?" The cold breath that followed slid down the side of his neck, and he stepped forward into the trees without realizing it. The ground was soft, sinking slightly under his weight. The porch was gone when he turned back. No house, no light, only more forest. The darkness between the trees thickened, shapes moving faintly within it. Some were tall and thin, others low to the ground, all watching without sound. A faint path wound ahead, pale under the faint, sourceless glow that filtered through the mist. He followed it, though each step felt less like his own choice and more like an instruction. The forest was silent, except for the faint, steady sound of footsteps behind him, matching his pace exactly. He didn't look back. The path narrowed until the trees on either side pressed in close enough for their damp bark to brush his shoulders. The mist thickened, and with it came whispers, not words exactly, but threads of sound that wound around his thoughts, pulling them apart. The path ended at a clearing. In its center sat the same chair from the upstairs room, facing away from him toward nothing at all. The pale blue light from before filled the clearing, though there was no window here, no moon, no visible source. The chair was empty. He stepped forward, drawn toward it. The air grew colder with each step, the ground softer, until he felt water seeping into his shoes. When he reached the chair, he saw it clearly, the same wood, the same arms worn smooth by years of use, and then a hand, pale and thin, settled on its back. He turned. The man was there, black eyes fixed on him, face still shifting faintly at the edges. But now there was no question about the smile. It was wide, wrong, too still. "This is where you belong." The trees behind the figure leaned inward, their trunks twisting faintly as though eager to close. The mist swirled higher, wrapping around his legs, pulling. The man stepped closer, and the darkness swallowed everything